At that time in our relationship, things were getting tough, and we started to really look out for each other. We had already done 72 shows, and the pressure was growing. CBS had very strict rules for the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Every moment of the show was reviewed carefully, and every single word had to be approved before airing. But on September 17, 1967, something unexpected happened. Something slipped past the censors. The director didn't notice it, and even the Smothers Brothers themselves had no idea until much later. During the Who's performance on the show, the camera accidentally captured something in the background. What was seen confirmed what many people had suspected for a long time but could never actually prove. The Smothers Brothers' story began with heartbreak. Their father, Major Thomas B. Smothers Jr., served as an Army officer. In 1941, during World War II, he was stationed in the Philippines. When Japan invaded, his wife Ruth and their 2 young sons were evacuated for safety. Major Smothers, however, was captured by enemy forces. He survived the brutal Bataan Death March, one of the most horrific events of the war. Later, he was sent to Fukuoka No. 22, a harsh Japanese prison camp known for its terrible conditions. In April 1945, when the war was nearly over, Major Smothers became too ill to continue working. On April 25, he was transferred from Fukuoka to Korea, but he never made it to his destination. Some reports claim that he was buried at sea, while others say he was cremated after dying in Korea. Out of the 110 men who were transported with him, only 36 survived. Major Smothers was the last one to die. His wife, Ruth, was left behind to raise their 2 sons, Tom and Dick, on her own. Tom was born in 1937, and Dick in 1938. The family settled in California, where Ruth worked long hours to support her children. Life was difficult, and the loss of their father left a lasting mark on both boys. The hardship they faced growing up became a big part of what shaped their humor and view of the world. That mix of pain and wit later became one of the reasons their comedy felt so real and relatable to people everywhere. Their rise to fame began in 1959 at a small club in San Francisco called the Purple Onion. Originally, they were booked for only 2 weeks, but their act was such a huge success that the club kept them on for an incredible 36 weeks. Their unique combination of folk music, sharp timing, and playful storytelling made audiences fall in love with them. They weren't just another musical duo, they were brothers who could make people laugh just by talking to each other. One night, a flamenco dancer who was supposed to perform got injured, and Tom and Dick stepped in to fill the time. That unexpected moment showed just how naturally funny and talented they were. By the end of their long run at the Purple Onion, the brothers were making $2,000 a week, which was an amazing jump from the $2 a night they had been earning just a few months earlier. Their first record, The Smothers Brothers at the Purple Onion, was released in 1961, and it instantly launched their national career. But their partnership had started years before the Purple Onion. Back in college, Tom had formed a small musical group called the Casual Quintet. He played guitar, and when Dick wanted to join, he quickly learned how to play the bass just so he could be part of it. Over time, the other members left, leaving only Tom and Dick. To keep the audience entertained between songs, they began joking and teasing each other. Those in-between jokes got as many laughs as the music itself, and they realized they had stumbled upon something special. That natural sibling banter became their signature style. On stage, Tom played the silly, innocent brother, while Dick took on the role of the serious, more responsible one. They constantly bickered and interrupted each other, which felt real because it was. Their chemistry was genuine, they didn't need to fake it. One of their most famous running jokes was Tom whining, "Mom always liked you best," which audiences adored. People saw themselves and their own family relationships in those moments. The honesty of their comedy was what made it stand out. It wasn't polished or fake, it was warm, real, and full of heart. They weren't afraid to show emotion or vulnerability, and that made their performances unforgettable. By the mid-1960s, the Smothers Brothers had become big names in entertainment, and their success was still growing. That's when CBS decided to give them their own television show. At the time, CBS was struggling to compete with NBC's hit series Bonanza, which dominated the Sunday night ratings. The network was desperate for a new kind of show that could attract younger audiences. The Smothers Brothers were the perfect choice. They were funny, charming, and connected deeply with the changing spirit of the 1960s, a time filled with political awareness, social change, and rebellion against authority. When the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour premiered, it quickly became one of the most talked about shows on television. It was fresh, unpredictable, and often pushed the limits of what was considered acceptable for TV. The brothers used humor to comment on serious issues like war, censorship, and politics, which made the show controversial but also groundbreaking. CBS, however, wasn't always happy with their boldness. The network had a team of censors who carefully reviewed every line, trying to remove anything they thought was too risky or offensive. Still, despite all the scrutiny, things sometimes slipped through, like the unexpected moment during The Who's performance that aired live on September 17, 1967. That broadcast became legendary not only because of the band's explosive performance but also because of what viewers caught in the background, something that the network had never intended to show. It proved that even the most tightly controlled environments can't stop the truth from revealing itself. The Smothers Brothers' journey wasn't just about comedy, it was about resilience, creativity, and staying true to who they were. From growing up without their father to struggling through years of small performances, they turned their pain into laughter. Their humor came from real life, the ups, the downs, the teasing, and the love between brothers who had been through everything together. Even as they faced pressure from television executives and constant censorship, Tom and Dick never stopped pushing boundaries. Their legacy wasn't only in their jokes or songs but in their courage to speak honestly through humor. They showed that comedy could be smart, emotional, and even revolutionary, a way to tell the truth when others were afraid to. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour may have been filled with laughter, but behind every joke was the story of two brothers who refused to give up, not on their dreams, not on each other, and not on what they believed in. At that time, Bonanza was one of the biggest shows on television, attracting nearly a quarter of all American viewers. It had already beaten two of CBS's most popular programs, Perry Mason and The Gary Moore Show, leaving the network desperate to find something new and bold. CBS knew they needed a change, something that could appeal to a younger audience. They believed the Smothers Brothers were the perfect answer. Tom and Dick Smothers were funny, clever, and different from anyone else on TV. CBS hoped their humor and style would make the network feel fresh and modern again. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour premiered on February 5, 1967. At first glance, it seemed like a typical variety show, much like others airing at the time. Ed Sullivan even introduced them as two regular American kids. But it didn't take long for audiences to realize these brothers were anything but typical. From the beginning, they used their comedy to talk about real issues. They joked about the Vietnam War, made fun of politicians, and weren't afraid to challenge authority. Their humor was smart, sharp, and daring, and people loved it. Within just 2 weeks, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour managed to beat Bonanza in the ratings. Young people tuned in every week, excited to see something new, something that spoke to their generation. Advertisers were thrilled, and CBS finally had the hit they had been searching for. Before the show began, Tom Smothers had made one crucial demand: total creative control. He wanted the freedom to choose what to say and how to say it, without CBS executives interfering. The network agreed, mostly because they were desperate for a success. That decision gave the brothers a rare kind of power in television, and they used it fully. They invited guests who reflected the changing times, including folk singers like Pete Seeger, whose songs often carried strong anti-war messages. They made jokes about President Lyndon B. Johnson right on national TV, something few would have dared to do at the time. Every episode felt unpredictable and alive. The audience never knew what might happen next. The show constantly felt like a risk, but that's exactly what made it so exciting. Of course, CBS's censors were not happy. They watched the show closely and often tried to block material they thought was too controversial. But Tom and Dick didn't back down. Instead, they turned censorship itself into part of their comedy. They openly joked about being censored, making fun of the network's rules right on air. That clever defiance only made viewers love them more. Behind the scenes, the writing team was just as bold as the hosts. Many young writers who would later become legends in comedy got their start on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. The list included Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, Lorne Michaels, and David Steinberg. Together, they wrote comedy that wasn't just funny, it was meaningful. Their sketches commented on real life, politics, and culture in ways that TV had rarely seen before. This group of writers would go on to shape the future of American comedy. The style and courage they developed on the Smothers Brothers show influenced later classics like Saturday Night Live, All in the Family, and The Mary Tyler Moore Show. The Smothers Brothers had become more than entertainers, they were helping to transform television itself. In 1968, the show made history again. On October 6, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour aired the Beatles' promotional film for Hey Jude. Only a few weeks earlier, on September 8, people in the United Kingdom had seen it for the first time, but this was the American debut. At that time, music videos didn't exist, they were called promotional films. The Beatles had filmed Hey Jude at Twickenham Studios on September 4, 1968. Paul McCartney had personally designed the set, which featured a large orchestra dressed in white tuxedos and about 300 fans singing the song's famous ending together. It was a powerful and emotional performance, not just because of the song, but because Ringo Starr had recently rejoined the band after briefly quitting. The performance symbolized unity and renewal for the Beatles. For American audiences, seeing this on television was groundbreaking. It wasn't just another music performance, it was a new kind of visual art, one that connected music, storytelling, and imagery in a way people had never seen before. But that wasn't all. Just 1 week later, the Smothers Brothers aired another Beatles promotional film, this time for Revolution. 2 Beatles videos in back-to-back weeks was unheard of on American television. It gave fans across the country a whole new way to experience their favorite band. Even The Ed Sullivan Show, which had famously introduced the Beatles to the U.S., didn't have that kind of access. The Smothers Brothers had built such a strong connection with the music world that they could bring exclusive material straight to their viewers. That moment marked a real turning point. Music was changing, and so was television. The show became a symbol of a generation that wanted more truth, more creativity, and more freedom to express ideas openly. But controversy wasn't far behind. In 1967, the same show sparked another major event when Pete Seeger was invited to perform. For nearly 17 years, Seeger had been banned from American television because of his political beliefs and his refusal to testify before the House Un-American Activities Committee during the McCarthy era. He had been blacklisted, unable to appear on major networks. When the Smothers Brothers invited him to perform his song Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, it was a powerful statement. The song, told through a simple story about soldiers following their leader into a dangerous river, was clearly a metaphor criticizing President Johnson's handling of the Vietnam War. It was a brave, direct challenge to U.S. policy, and CBS didn't like it. When the episode aired in September 1967, CBS censored the performance, cutting the song completely. Viewers never saw it. But the act of censorship only made the song, and the Smothers Brothers, even more famous. It showed how far the brothers were willing to go to give artists and comedians a voice, even when the network tried to silence them. The Smothers Brothers had started as 2 young men making people laugh in small clubs, but by the late 1960s, they were at the heart of a cultural revolution. They had turned their variety show into something more than entertainment, it became a platform for art, truth, and social change. Week after week, they made America laugh, think, and sometimes even argue. In a time when the country was divided by war, politics, and generational conflict, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour gave people something rare, honest conversation through humor. They weren't afraid to question authority, make fun of power, or shine a light on uncomfortable truths. Their legacy wasn't just in the laughs they created, but in the courage they showed to keep comedy real, even when the cost was high. Tom Smothers refused to stay silent after CBS censored Pete Seeger's anti-war song. He made sure the story reached the media, and public outrage quickly followed. The backlash was so strong that CBS had no choice but to let Seeger perform again. On February 25, 1968, millions of Americans finally watched him sing Waist Deep in the Big Muddy Uncensored. It was a historic moment, the first time a blacklisted artist had so openly criticized a sitting president on national television. The performance showed the true power of protest music and how it could challenge authority and inspire change. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour also became a stage for musicians no other network would dare to feature. Between 1967 and 1969, the show welcomed legendary but rebellious acts like The Who, The Doors, Jefferson Airplane, Buffalo Springfield, and Steppenwolf. These weren't the safe, family-friendly performers that CBS executives were comfortable with. They were young, outspoken, and often controversial. But that was exactly why Tom and Dick Smothers wanted them. They wanted to bring real voices, raw emotion, and the sound of rebellion into America's living rooms. The Who's appearance became one of the most infamous moments in TV history. During their performance of My Generation, drummer Keith Moon decided to take his trademark chaos to the next level. Unknown to his bandmates or the crew, he secretly packed his drum kit with real explosives, far more than anyone expected. When the performance reached its finale, the explosion was massive. Smoke and sparks filled the stage as a deafening blast shook the studio. Pete Townshend was thrown off balance, and the shockwave blew up his hair and caused permanent damage to his hearing. A piece of a cymbal hit Moon himself, knocking him backward. For a few stunned seconds, the audience sat in total silence, then erupted into cheers. It was pure mayhem, and it became one of rock's most legendary TV moments, but it came at a painful cost. The Doors also made an unforgettable appearance, performing their hit Touch Me backed by a full orchestra. Jefferson Airplane performed Crown of Creation, a haunting song that reflected the fear of nuclear war during the Cold War era. Buffalo Springfield played their protest anthem For What It's Worth, a song that had become the unofficial soundtrack of the 1960s youth movement. And when Steppenwolf performed Born to Be Wild, their powerful, gritty sound captured the spirit of rebellion that defined the decade. Each performance brought something bold and new to television, music that spoke to a generation unafraid to question authority. Tom and Dick didn't care if it scared the network or made executives nervous. They cared about giving artists a voice, especially those who had something meaningful to say. Their stage became a place where art, politics, and protest could exist side by side. Many of rock's biggest stars appreciated that freedom. One of their most famous supporters was Jimi Hendrix. On April 26, 1969, during a concert at the Los Angeles Forum, Hendrix paused before playing a song and dedicated the performance to the Smothers Brothers. He called them heroes for creating a space where art and protest could live together on national TV. At the time, Hendrix was at the peak of his career, and his words carried weight. By then, however, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour had already been canceled by CBS, which had grown tired of the show's controversies. Hendrix's tribute was his way of saying thank you, a public acknowledgement that the Smothers Brothers had made a difference. The show didn't just mix music and politics, it also used humor to reflect the counterculture of the 1960s. One of its most popular and clever recurring sketches was Share a Little Tea with Goldie. In it, actress Lee French played Goldie O'Keefe, a spacey, sweet-talking hippie who offered bizarre, double-meaning advice. The sketch was full of subtle jokes about drug culture that slipped past many older viewers but were instantly recognized by younger audiences. The name Goldie O'Keefe was a play on words. O'Keefe sounded like keef, a slang term for cannabis. Originally, the character's last name was just Keefe, but CBS censors forced the producers to change it. Even so, the meaning was obvious to those who understood the culture. When Goldie talked about tea, everyone knew she wasn't referring to a hot beverage, it was a coded reference to marijuana. She also used the word roach, and the audience knew she didn't mean an insect. Despite CBS's efforts to tone things down, Share a Little Tea with Goldie became a fan favorite. Younger viewers loved it because it felt like the show was speaking directly to them, using humor to wink at their generation while keeping the older audience none the wiser. The Smothers Brothers had managed to sneak countercultural ideas onto mainstream TV, and make them funny at the same time. That was the genius of the show. It used comedy and music as tools to communicate messages that mattered, even when the censors tried to hold them back. Each episode felt like a balancing act between art and authority. Tom Smothers often clashed with CBS executives over what could and couldn't be said, but he never backed down. He believed television could be more than mindless entertainment, it could be a mirror reflecting society's truths, even the uncomfortable ones. The explosive performance by The Who symbolized the energy of the era, wild, passionate, and unpredictable. The show's political humor represented the questioning spirit of a generation that was tired of being told to stay quiet. And Goldie's sketch showed that rebellion didn't always have to be loud, sometimes, it could be delivered with a smile and a sly joke. Even after CBS canceled the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour in 1969, its impact didn't fade. The show had proven that comedy could be fearless and that television could be a platform for change. The people who worked on it, from writers to musicians, went on to shape the future of American entertainment. The Smothers Brothers themselves became symbols of integrity in an industry that often chose safety over honesty. What made Tom and Dick special wasn't just that they made people laugh. It was that they used laughter as a weapon, to challenge censorship, to support free speech, and to remind people that humor could be powerful. They understood that comedy wasn't just about jokes, it was about truth, timing, and courage. So when Jimi Hendrix stood on stage and called them heroes, he wasn't exaggerating. The Smothers Brothers had changed television forever. They brought the sounds of rebellion into homes across America, gave voice to those who had been silenced, and proved that art, no matter how controversial, has the power to move hearts and minds. Their show might have ended, but the spirit they unleashed, bold, funny, and unafraid, continued to echo through comedy, music, and culture for generations to come. Townsend would end up losing almost 90% of his hearing in one ear after that night. The ringing that came afterward was constant and painful, something he could never escape. Even years later, he talked about the discomfort and how the damage made it harder for him to play guitar. That one event left a mark on him and on everyone who was there. It completely changed how the band performed from then on. In the middle of the smoke and confusion, Townsend suddenly grabbed Tom Smothers' acoustic guitar and smashed it right on stage. Tom just stood there in shock, unable to say anything. The act seemed to fit perfectly with the chaos of the moment, loud, rebellious, and raw. It was exactly what The Who were known for, breaking rules and defying expectations. That explosion in the broken guitar became more than just a wild moment, it became a piece of rock and roll history. Young fans thought it was thrilling, a symbol of freedom and rebellion. Older audiences, though, were horrified. They saw it as disrespectful and outrageous. The performance revealed a clear divide between generations. Parents hated it, but their kids saw it as liberation. It was shocking, emotional, and unforgettable, the very thing The Who and the Smothers Brothers wanted to achieve. But they weren't the only ones making waves. Joan Baez, a famous folk singer and activist, was also challenging the system. Born on January 9, 1941, in Staten Island, New York, Baez had built her life around fighting for peace and justice. By 1967, she had already been arrested for protesting, and her music had become the voice of people who wanted change. When she appeared on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, she wanted to dedicate a song to her husband, David Harris. Harris had refused to be drafted into the Vietnam War and was sentenced to 3 years in jail for his stand. Baez was proud of him and said so during the show, but CBS censored most of what she said. They only left in a short, vague dedication before she started to sing. Her censored moment was just one of many signs that CBS was under a lot of pressure. The network didn't want to upset the government or risk losing sponsors. Even President Lyndon B. Johnson had complained directly about the show. In fact, he once stayed up until 3 in the morning to call CBS personally and demand that they control the Smothers Brothers. Later, President Nixon pushed even harder, trying to get them taken off the air completely. In 1968, the show invited Harry Belafonte, another well-known singer and activist, to perform. They planned a daring and emotional segment. Belafonte sang "Lord, Don't Stop the Carnival" while real footage played in the background, showing police beating anti-war protesters during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. It was a powerful mix of music and truth. But CBS refused to air it. They cut the entire performance and replaced the 5 minutes of airtime with political ads from the Republican Party. What was meant to be a protest against political violence was turned into a message supporting the very politicians responsible for it. It showed clearly where the network's loyalties were. By late 1968, the pressure on the Smothers Brothers had grown unbearable. CBS demanded to see every script, every joke, and every song lyric before the show could air. They even required full videotapes to be submitted for review days in advance. The censors would go through everything carefully, picking apart each line, hunting for anything that might offend, political jokes, comments about the Vietnam War, religion, or even light-hearted humor that seemed too bold. Every single detail had to pass their strict approval process. Guest stars who had edgy humor or controversial opinions were often censored, and some were cut out of the show entirely. CBS even set a rule that all materials had to be submitted 10 days before each broadcast. For a comedy show that often relied on timely humor and current events, that was almost impossible. The rule wasn't just about organization, it was meant to stop the brothers from pushing limits or saying anything unpredictable. Despite all this, the Smothers Brothers kept trying to make their show about truth, humor, and freedom of speech. They brought in guests who represented different voices, musicians, comedians, and activists, giving them a space to speak when few others would. Their show was one of the only places on television that openly questioned the government and the war, and for many viewers, that honesty was refreshing. But for CBS and the political establishment, it was dangerous. The conflict between the show's rebellious spirit and the network's cautious control kept growing. Every week became a battle to get their message out. Scripts were rewritten, lines were cut, and performances were shortened or deleted entirely. Still, the Smothers Brothers refused to give in completely. They believed television should be more than entertainment, it should reflect the truth of what was happening in the world. Meanwhile, audiences kept tuning in. The show was controversial but popular, especially among young viewers who saw it as a symbol of resistance. The mix of comedy, music, and political commentary felt new and alive, something no other show on TV was doing. But behind the scenes, CBS executives worried that the Smothers Brothers were going too far. Sponsors threatened to pull out. Politicians complained. The tension reached a breaking point. When you look back now, that era of television feels like a turning point. It showed how much power media had, and how much fear that power created in those who tried to control it. Artists like Pete Townsend, Joan Baez, Harry Belafonte, and the Smothers Brothers were part of a cultural rebellion that challenged censorship and demanded change. They didn't always win, but their courage left a lasting impression. Townsend's guitar smash became a symbol of artistic rebellion. Baez's censored dedication reminded people that truth was being silenced. Belafonte's cut performance exposed the hypocrisy of networks that claimed to care about free expression but bowed to political pressure. And through it all, the Smothers Brothers kept fighting for the right to speak freely on national television. Their story isn't just about a TV show, it's about a time when music, politics, and media collided in a way that changed everything. What happened on that stage and behind those studio doors became part of a larger movement for artistic and political freedom. Even decades later, those moments still echo, reminding us how powerful one voice, or one song, can be, even in the face of censorship. The writers of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour were exhausted. They felt trapped in a never-ending cycle of rewriting, resubmitting, and waiting for approval from CBS. Every week, it was the same struggle. Even when they finally met the network's strict rules, CBS would demand new changes at the very last moment, sometimes just hours before the show was supposed to air. The writers began joking that the process felt like death by 1,000 cuts, but beneath the humor was real frustration. They were being slowly silenced. One day, Tom and Dick Smothers decided to fight back in their own clever way. They came up with a sketch that made fun of the censorship itself. In the skit, Tom played a censor holding a giant pair of scissors, cutting up scripts and stopping performers mid-sentence. The meaning was obvious: their creative freedom was being destroyed. The sketch ended with a bold punchline: the screen went completely silent, showing exactly what censorship felt like. But CBS didn't find it funny. The network refused to air it, claiming it would hurt their image. Not long after, comedian Elaine May appeared in another sketch with a similar theme. Her final line summed up everything: if we're not allowed to say anything important, we're just fooling you with empty jokes. Cut deep. But that sketch was also banned. Tom was furious. At that point, the censorship had become so extreme that even jokes about censorship were not allowed. Still, the brothers weren't ready to surrender. They decided to play a clever game with CBS. Since the network was enforcing strict deadlines for submitting tapes, Tom and Dick began delivering their final versions as late as possible. Sometimes they'd send in a safe version for CBS to review, then sneak in a few edits or bolder lines right before airtime. It was risky, but it was their way of keeping their creative voice alive. This constant back and forth infuriated CBS executives. The network accused the brothers of breaking their contract by missing deadlines. Finally, in April 1969, CBS claimed that the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour had failed to deliver an episode on time, and used that as an excuse to cancel the show. In truth, there was evidence that CBS had caused many of the delays themselves. But the deadline issue was just a cover. The real reason was control. Tom Smothers would later say that CBS's actions were part of a plan to silence them completely. They didn't just want to cancel the show, he said. They wanted to choke off our voice. The fight quickly spilled into the media. The New York Times published a strong editorial criticizing CBS, saying the network had turned the Smothers Brothers into hostages of their own creativity. Public support poured in. Fans flooded CBS with letters and phone calls demanding the show's return. Protests broke out. Other artists, comedians, and even some politicians spoke up in defense of the brothers. What had started as a simple television dispute had now become a national debate about free speech and creative freedom on American TV. CBS executives were caught off guard by the backlash. They held emergency meetings, trying to figure out how to handle the growing outrage. But the Smothers Brothers refused to back down. Tom stood firm, saying, "They're not just shutting down our show. They're trying to shut down the truth." His words struck a chord with people across the country. The cancellation of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour became a turning point in television history, a moment that exposed the tension between art, politics, and corporate control. Meanwhile, CBS was facing another major problem: their advertisers were starting to pull out. Big sponsors like Ford and Procter & Gamble didn't want their brands associated with a show that openly mocked politics and questioned the Vietnam War. They worried about losing customers who might find the content too controversial. Within a few months, CBS had lost millions of dollars in advertising revenue. Internal documents later revealed that pressure from these sponsors was one of the main reasons the show was canceled. It became clear that even a top-rated program could be sacrificed if it threatened business interests. The Smothers Brothers eventually sued CBS for wrongful termination, and they won. But as Tom later reflected, "We won the lawsuit, but we lost the culture war." The message from advertisers and networks was clear: speak too freely, and you'll pay the price. The final blow came from a single joke. During a March 1969 episode, Dick Smothers did an impression of President Nixon and said, "I will end the Vietnam War as soon as I can find where the off button is." It was short, sharp, and undeniably funny, but also painfully true. The joke enraged CBS executives and terrified sponsors. The Vietnam War was still raging, and Nixon was a sensitive subject for both the government and corporate America. The network, already nervous about the show's reputation, decided that this was the last straw. On April 4, 1969, CBS abruptly canceled the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. The announcement came without warning, shocking both the cast and fans. Just like that, one of the most daring shows on television, a show that had challenged censorship, mocked authority, and given a platform to some of the era's most outspoken artists, was gone. Even after the cancellation, the impact of the Smothers Brothers lingered. They had pushed the boundaries of what television could be and had paid the price for it. Their fight wasn't just about comedy, it was about freedom of speech, artistic expression, and the right to question power. Looking back, their struggle revealed the limits of creative freedom in a system controlled by money and politics. The writers who once joked about death by 1,000 cuts had been right all along. Every edit, every censored line, every pulled sketch had been another cut, until the show finally bled out. But their legacy lived on. Future comedians, musicians, and talk show hosts would remember what the Smothers Brothers had done. They had proven that television could be more than entertainment. It could challenge people to think, to question, and to demand truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable. Though CBS tried to silence them, the Smothers Brothers became symbols of artistic courage. Their story remains a reminder that creativity and honesty often come at a cost, but that cost can inspire generations to keep fighting for their voices to be heard. CBS said the Smothers Brothers had failed to deliver their show tapes on time, but everyone knew that wasn't the real reason for their cancellation. The truth was, the network was tired of their political jokes and anti-war messages. The show had already been renewed for another season, and an episode featuring comedian David Steinberg giving another anti-war sermon was ready to air. But instead of showing it in the United States, CBS pulled it and broadcast it only in Canada. The cancellation came without warning, and it shocked everyone. It sent a message across the entertainment industry: step out of line, and your career could end instantly. The Smothers Brothers didn't just walk away. They took CBS to court for breach of contract, beginning a long and difficult 4-year legal battle. Finally, in April 1973, they won the case. A judge ruled in their favor and awarded them $776,300, worth more than $5.5 million today. The court's decision was historic. It made it clear that television networks couldn't hide censorship behind business excuses. But even though they had won in court, the victory felt hollow. Their groundbreaking show was already gone, and they had lost the audience they once inspired. After that, nothing they did could match the magic of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. They tried returning to television with a toned-down version on NBC, but it never took off. CBS quickly filled their old-time slot with Hee-Haw, a light-hearted country variety show full of corny jokes, folk music, and zero controversy. It was everything the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour wasn't: safe, simple, and unchallenging. The show ran for 23 seasons, proving that networks preferred predictable entertainment over anything bold or risky. The loss of their show deeply affected both Tom and Dick Smothers. Tom took it the hardest. Years later, he admitted that being canceled by CBS shattered his confidence and left a lasting emptiness. Dick coped in his own way, turning to hobbies like car racing and winemaking. Both brothers were forever changed by the experience, carrying the emotional scars for years to come. Still, they weren't done trying. In the summer of 1970, just a year after being fired, the Smothers Brothers made a comeback attempt on ABC. But the world had moved on. The Vietnam War was slowing down, and audiences were tired of rebellion and political humor. ABC kept them under tight control, determined to avoid the kind of controversy that had haunted CBS. They told the brothers to play it safe. The show lost its spark, the ratings dropped, and ABC canceled it before the fall season. It was proof of how quickly public taste can shift. One year they were revolutionary, the next, they seemed outdated. In January 1975, they tried again, this time returning to NBC. Their premiere episode was a hit, ranking as the 5th most-watched show in the country with a massive 50% audience share, an impossible number by today's standards. But behind the scenes, problems quickly grew. Their producer, Joe Hamilton, clashed with Tom and Dick over creative control. Tom wasn't even allowed to do retakes without losing part of his pay. The brothers weren't allowed to freely meet with writers or talk to the press. As the tension grew, the ratings fell. Hamilton eventually quit, frustrated by the constant conflict. NBC handed Tom control for the final 4 episodes, and during that time, the show rediscovered some of its old fire. They joked about taboo topics like cocaine, something almost unheard of on primetime television at the time, and featured major guests such as Ringo Starr and George Carlin. But even that wasn't enough. NBC canceled the show halfway through the season. Once again, the networks had proven how easily creativity could be shut down. Then, nearly 2 decades later, something unexpected happened. In 1988, almost 20 years after firing them, CBS invited the Smothers Brothers back for a 1-hour reunion special titled The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, the 20th reunion. It was a nostalgic moment, bringing together many of their old writers, including Steve Martin and Bob Einstein. The special earned 3 Primetime Emmy nominations and was warmly received by audiences and critics. But while it was touching, it lacked the rebellious edge of the original. The humor was safe, the jokes gentle. The cultural fire that once made them dangerous was gone. That same year, CBS decided to take another chance and revive the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour as a weekly show. But timing worked against them again. The Writers Guild was on strike. Without writers, the brothers had to rely on old routines and let guest stars carry most of the comedy. When the strike ended, they regained some momentum and even earned 5 Emmy nominations. But television had changed. The boldness that once defined them no longer stood out. The revival ran for 2 seasons, from March 1988 to August 1989, before quietly ending. Even so, their legacy continued to grow. In 2022, the University of California, Santa Barbara, accepted the Smothers Brothers Complete Archive into its Performing Arts collection. The archive included contracts, legal documents, photos, recordings, and music sheets. Curator David Subert said it belonged alongside collections in the Library of Congress because of its importance to American culture. The archive tells the story of their ongoing fight for free speech and their lasting influence on television comedy. Their work proved that comedy could do more than make people laugh, it could question authority and inspire change. Before Saturday Night Live ever existed, the Smothers Brothers had already opened that door. From 1967 to 1969, they used their show to make bold jokes about war, censorship, and politics. Writers like Lorne Michaels, who would go on to create SNL, learned from their approach. Comedians such as Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, John Oliver, and Samantha Bee followed in their footsteps, continuing the idea that comedy could challenge power while entertaining millions. The Smothers Brothers also gave early opportunities to some of comedy's biggest names. Steve Martin was one of their first writers. Rob Reiner and George Carlin were regular performers. Many of these future legends later said they owed their careers to that show. The brothers had created a space where comedians could take risks, where humor could have meaning. That energy changed American comedy forever, giving it a sharper, braver edge. When CBS canceled the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour in 1969, the brothers didn't just lose a show, they started a movement. Their fight for free expression became a symbol of artistic courage. Their courtroom victory showed that even against powerful networks, truth and creativity could win, at least in principle. It was one of the first times a comedy show had successfully stood up to corporate censorship, and it set a lasting precedent for freedom on television. At a time when America was divided over war, civil rights, and culture, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour acted as a bridge between art and activism. They invited guests like The Who, Jefferson Airplane, and Simon and Garfunkel, and gave band folk singers like Pete Seeger a voice again. They even introduced the Beatles' Hey Jude music video to America for the first time. For millions of viewers, this show was their first taste of the counterculture that was reshaping the country. As comedian Bill Maher later said, the Smothers Brothers' power came from their fearlessness. They weren't afraid to offend those who disagreed with them. They didn't try to please everyone. They proved that comedy could take a stand, that it could mean something. Even decades later, that lesson still stands. The Smothers Brothers showed that laughter could be a form of protest, and that when used with courage, comedy could change the world.